Number 3!
1976 could be charitably called a good year for carbon copies, even though the medium of giant robots didn't exactly benefit from it. There was only so much difference between the series that aired that year, and the ones that didn't stand out got trampled underfoot. Worse yet, they were all pretty much the same serious-minded, hard-nosed sorts of series. A lighthearted tone was mostly left to the wayside. That all changed with Yataman, which began its broadcast run on January 1st, 1977. While Tekka Man flopped and Go Oppa 5 Godam was even more of a miserable failure, Tatsunoko Productions realized that this whole mecha thing might still have some legs, and that doing the same thing that Kamen Rider and Getter Robo did was not going to pay dividends. And so they decided to whip up something entirely different. Realizing that the whole giant robot beats up alien baddies thing was overplayed even by this point in the genre's existence, Tatsunoko's Yataman decided to eschew the villainous space mutants and toss in a bunch of goofballs who just like to screw people out of money. The Doronbo gang, consisting of Boyaki, Tonzura, and Doronjo, were marginally searching around the world for the Dokuro stones, which were said to bring vast riches. Gon and Ai, who stopped crime as the masked heroes Yataman 1 and Yataman 2, are determined to stop them, or at least send them flying. Mostly what happens is that they end up halfway across the globe, getting beat up by the titular heroes in their giant robot mecha, Yata 1. Yata 1 isn't exactly known for being a great fighter, instead he's more known for being a carrier type, who produces mini-mecha after eating mecha food. As would be the format for the 108 episode run, the villains come up with some kind of scam or get a lead on a Dokuro stone, and the heroes would travel to face them down. And it all centered around some kind of goofy pun or parody of a country or group that week. And of course, it all ends in a big kaboom. What really set this one apart was not the interesting main characters, who were a bit flat even for stock heroes, but the villains. Doronjo and her two lunkheads proved to be far more popular and have such good chemistry that it's easy to forget the show isn't technically about them. Likewise, Doronjo was given unprecedented character development for a villain at that time, going from nothing more than a baddie of the week to a fully realized character who wants to retire from crime, but just can't seem to swing it. Comedy and mecha fused together like never before. Yataman would come to be the groundwork for the rest of the Time Bokan series to come, though few got quite as popular and well-loved as that particular series. Another entry that year was Jetter Mars, who you might find a little familiar. Osamu Tezuka was not having a good year. His production company was in the red, and the rights to his characters, specifically Astro Boy, were in flux. So with a deadline for Toei looming, he threw ears and a scarf on Tetsuwan Atom and created Jetter Mars. Originally airing on February 3rd, Jetter Mars was Toei's Astro Boy, almost identically, and many of the stories in this series were reworkings of classic Astro Boy stories. Given that it was Tezuka's work and all the elements that made Astro Boy great were still involved, it received mixed success. The series itself only lasted for 27 episodes before Tezuka resecured his own copyrights and relaunched his own production house. Astro Boy would burst back onto Japanese television screens in full color a few years later. Going right back into the swing of typical robot shows for this year, the first one to come out was Mecha Robo. Well, Go Oppa 5 Godam was the victim of bad timing, and some of the other robot shows from the 1975 and 1976 were produced just on the cheap. This was the first one that was really, actually bad. There was an astonishing lack of personality to it, and the series as a whole just didn't have a lot of traction. The character designs were more than uninspired, and the pilots had about as much personality as a wet paper towel. Worse yet, the already flimsy animation was upended by the show's sponsor going bankrupt in October of that year. 29 episodes in, the budget dried up and the animation, which was already lax, turned entirely to stock footage. Mercifully, the show ended in late December after an embarrassingly mediocre conclusion. Aside from that, the most notable thing about Mecha Robo was the time limit imposed on its operation. He would fight alongside Earth forces against the Doron Empire from Ganymede, which is not our Ganymede, but some other Ganymede. And if the robot fought for too long, Omega missiles from space would lock onto its nuclear reactor and atomize it. It did have some pretty brutal action sequences to it, but nothing was nearly as brutal as trying to sit through it. Mercifully, there was something with a little bit more bite to it in the wings. Reiji Matsumoto created Planet Robo Dangard Ace, which began its broadcast run on March 6 of 1977. This featured much more of the Matsumoto style to it than other robot shows, with a lot more depth to the plotline and political maneuvering involved. Takuma, the pilot of Vanguard Ace, is visually somewhere between Duke Fleet and Kodai of Space Battleship Yamato, and acts about like you'd expect out of a robot pilot. The robot itself is not a huge player in the stories, and lacks much in the way of personality. This marks a turning point in the way mecha shows were handled, as this series has much more in common with 1930s serials like Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers than it does Mazinger Z or Getter Robo. It's still a far cry from real robots as they become to known, but it's more of a space opera in the vein of Captain Harlock. The genre itself was starting to slip the moorings that it started with, and the trend towards real robots was starting to press forward. Meanwhile, in the live-action world, Shotaro Ishinomori went right to work on Daitetsujin 17, which shared more than a few similarities with Tetsujin 28 Go and Giant Robo, like the entire concept. While not specifically bad, the show itself merely continued the slowly moldering concept of the baseline giant robot. It's a machine built by an evil organization, controlled by a young kid, and featured mass destruction all about. While this wasn't anything terribly novel, it was in line with what people were basically expecting out of a robot show at this point, and was just another in a long list of forgettable mech shows. Speaking of forgettable mech shows, there was also Super Combining Magic Robot Ginguizer. This one took the usual character types and threw some magic in the mix. While it could be said that all these shows basically were magic, this is the only one that had come out and said it so brusquely. Writing might have had mystical elements, but the pilots of Ginguizer were actually the ones who were magical, which allowed them to pilot the robot. Voltes 5 was the successor to Combattler V, and it too enjoyed the same success that Combattler did. This one helped cement in everyone's minds how to do a 5-person pilot squad with a transforming robot, and it would later sire Tosho Daimos, which completed the robot romance trilogy as it would be known. Again, what shows like Ginguizer and Mecha Robo had a hard time grasping, the robot romance series nailed it seemingly effortlessly, bringing character, personality, and dramatic stories to a series designed more for selling toys and filling a time slot. And when it aired in the Philippines, they sure loved it. It has had a lasting impact to this day, as it was re-aired sporadically from 1986 to 1999, and then with a re-release Tagalog dub created in 2005. What Voltron is for America, Voltes 5 is for the Philippines, and I think the US got the short end of the stick on that. Storytelling was getting better, but it wouldn't be until a year later that storytelling would take a very dark turn. Originally airing on October 8, 1977, Invincible Superman Zambot 3 would be the work that propelled a young director and animator named Yoshiyuki Tomino into the limelight. Zambot 3 initially appeared to be a typical mecha story, where the transforming robot fought off mecha boost monsters week after week, with young teens at the helm to defend the Earth. It's even got a cockpit for Zambo Ace's mascot, Chonshiki. However, the series took a terrifying turn as the Gaizok forces started turning people into human bombs, and the end of the series most definitely earned the nickname Kill 'em All for Mr. Tomino. Needless to say, the series was beyond dark and one of the most gut-wrenching mech stories, even unto modern times. This was the first time that a robot series had had a proper tragic ending. Getter Robo played with it, but it was pretty tame compared to the horrific ending of Zambot 3, which was, most definitively, not getting a sequel. The same month, Great Dinosaur War Eisenborg started airing. This one was a bit of a weird one, because the show itself was animated, but all the action sequences were live action. Tsuburaya Productions and Studio Dean teamed up to create a fusion of anime and live action that had never been seen before, and with good reason. There is nothing particularly wrong with how either section of the show worked, but the fusion caused confusion. It ran through till June of the next year and was promptly forgotten about, especially in the wake of Zambot 3. The next year was a wasteland for giant robot shows. It was great for science fiction, as Gatchaman entered its second series, Galaxy Express 39 and Captain Harlock both aired, and Captain Future, based on a pulp sci-fi series from the 1940s, also got an anime adaptation. However, the robot field was bare as can be, leaving only Tosho Daimyos and Tomino's Daitarn 3 to speak of. Daitarn 3 was not a big success in its home country, though it did pretty well in Italy. Seeming somewhat shallow compared to the tearjerker that was Zambot 3, instead attempting to amuse with James Bond-like antics from its main hero, Banjo Haran. Likewise, Reiko and Beauty teamed up with him to fight off the Meganoid robot men who were bent on taking over the world in some way every week. It was a whole lot sillier than its previous entrant, and the Meganoids all had a bit of personality, taunting the hero and breaking up the monotonously dull silent robot fights of the genre. After all, how many times can you hear the same attack get called before it gets dull? The mecha genre had just hit its first growing pain. After dominating the airwaves for months on end, now, suddenly it was a very lonely place, while trains and pirate ships blew by it. But Tomino had a new idea for a show. It would have all of the things that great series needed. It would turn the genre on its head, and it would thrill the imagination the world over, if he could just nail the design.